The desert wind howled across the barren landscape of Nevada Territory in 1887, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of another scorching day. Sister Margaret Catherine had never imagined that her mission to bring comfort to the dying miners would lead her into the depths of the earth itself, much less into the presence of a man whose very existence challenged everything she had sworn to uphold. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what city you're watching from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. The Silver Creek mine had been bleeding men for months. Cave-ins, gas leaks, and the constant threat of collapse made it one of the most dangerous operations in the territory. Yet the promise of silver kept drawing desperate souls into its treacherous tunnels. Sister Margaret had arrived at the mining camp 3 days earlier, sent by the mission of St. Teresa to provide last rites and comfort to those who wouldn't make it out alive. She had not expected to encounter Jake Morrison. Standing 6 feet 4 inches tall with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway, Jake was the kind of man who commanded attention without saying a word. His hands, scarred from years of hard labor, could crush stone or gentle a frightened horse with equal skill. The miners respected him not just for his strength, but for his unwavering courage in the face of danger. When others hesitated, Jake descended deeper into the mine's belly, always the first to volunteer for the most perilous assignments. Their first meeting had been awkward, charged with an electricity that neither could name. Sister Margaret had been kneeling beside a dying miner, whispering prayers in Latin, when Jake emerged from the tunnel covered in dust and sweat. Their eyes met across the makeshift infirmary, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, the world seemed to pause. She felt something stir within her chest, something that had no place in the heart of a woman who had pledged herself to God. Jake, for his part, found himself captivated by the gentle strength in her green eyes. Beneath the severe black habit, he glimpsed a woman of remarkable beauty. But more than that, he sensed a kindred spirit, someone who understood sacrifice and duty, even if their paths had led them to vastly different places. The morning of the collapse dawned with an ominous stillness. The usual sounds of the desert, the cry of hawks, the rustle of tumbleweeds, seemed muted, as if nature itself held its breath. Sister Margaret had risen before dawn to pray, kneeling in the small tent that served as her quarters. Something felt different about this day, though she couldn't articulate what troubled her spirit. Jake had been in the mine since before sunrise, leading a crew to investigate reports of unstable support beams in the deepest section. The silver vein they were following had led them nearly a quarter-mile underground, far from the main shaft. It was dangerous work, but the potential reward was enormous, enough silver to make every man in the crew wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. Sister Margaret had felt compelled to visit the mine that morning, carrying with her a small wooden cross and a bottle of holy water. She told herself it was merely pastoral duty, a desire to bless the dangerous work being done below. But in her heart, she knew the truth. She wanted to see Jake again, to feel that strange stirring that both thrilled and terrified her. The mine foreman, a grizzled veteran named Murphy, had initially refused to let her descend. "It's no place for a lady, sister. Especially not today. The boys are spooked about something, and when miners get spooked, bad things tend to happen." But Sister Margaret possessed a quiet determination that few could resist. "These men risked their lives for silver, Mr. Murphy. Surely I can risk mine for their souls." Reluctantly, Murphy had allowed her to descend in the rickety elevator cage, warning her to stay close to the main tunnel and avoid the deeper workings where Jake's crew was operating. The descent into darkness felt like a journey into another world. The temperature dropped. The air grew thick and heavy, and the only sounds were the creaking of timber supports and the distant echo of pickaxes against stone. She had been underground for perhaps 20 minutes, moving carefully through the main tunnel with a lantern held high, when she heard Jake's voice calling out a warning. The words were indistinct, but the urgency in his tone was unmistakable. Then came the sound that would haunt her dreams for years to come, a deep, rumbling groan that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the earth. The collapse began slowly, almost gently, like a tired giant settling down to sleep. A few pebbles scattered from the ceiling, followed by a shower of dust. Then, with a roar that drowned out all other sound, the mountain came down. Sister Margaret found herself thrown against the tunnel wall as the world exploded around her. Rocks the size of wagon wheels crashed down, Timber supports snapped like matchsticks and the air filled with choking dust that turned day to night in an instant. She pressed herself against the stone, clutching her cross and praying with a fervor she had never known before. When the rumbling finally stopped and the dust began to settle, she found herself in a pocket of space no larger than a small room. The tunnel ahead and behind had been completely sealed by tons of fallen rock. Her lantern had somehow survived the collapse, casting eerie shadows on the walls of her stone prison. It was then that she heard the coughing. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone there? Sister?" The voice was deep, familiar, and filled with pain. "Sister Margaret, is that you? Jake?" She moved toward the sound, her heart pounding with relief and something else she dared not name. "Where are you?" "Here, behind this fall of rocks. Are you hurt?" She took inventory of her body. Bruised, certainly, and her habit was torn in several places, but nothing seemed broken. "I think I'm all right. What about you?" There was a pause, and when Jake spoke again, she could hear the strain in his voice. "My leg's pinned under a beam. I can't move it, but I don't think it's broken. The bleeding's not too bad." Sister Margaret pressed her hands against the wall of fallen stone that separated them. The rocks were too large and heavy for her to move alone, but perhaps together they could find a way through. "Can you see any light on your side?" "No, it's black as sin in here, but I can hear you clear enough. Sounds like you're maybe 10 feet away, though it might as well be 10 miles with all this rock between us." They worked for hours, Jake directing her efforts from his side of the barrier, while she carefully removed smaller stones and tried to widen the gaps between larger ones. Her hands grew raw and bloody. Her fingernails broke and her habit became filthy with dust and grime. But gradually, painstakingly, they managed to create an opening just large enough for her to squeeze through. When she finally emerged on Jake's side of the collapse, her lantern illuminated a scene that made her gasp. The big cowboy was trapped beneath a massive wooden beam, his right leg pinned from the knee down. Blood had pooled beneath him, though not as much as she had feared. His face was pale with pain and exertion, but his eyes were alert and focused on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Well," he said with a weak smile, "this isn't exactly how I pictured our second meeting." Despite everything, the danger, the pain, the impossibility of their situation, Sister Margaret found herself smiling back. "Nor I, but perhaps God has his reasons for bringing us together like this." "God's got a strange sense of humor if that's the case," Jake replied, then immediately looked stricken. "Sorry, sister, I didn't mean any disrespect." "None taken," she assured him, kneeling beside the beam that trapped him. "Now let's see what we can do about getting you free." The beam was far too heavy for her to lift alone, and Jake's position made it impossible for him to help. They tried using smaller pieces of wood as levers, but nothing worked. As the hours passed and their situation became increasingly clear, a grim reality settled over them both. They were trapped, possibly for days, with limited air and no food or water. It was Jake who first voiced what they were both thinking. "Sister, I need you to know something. If we don't make it out of here—" "We will," she interrupted firmly. "We have to believe that. But if we don't," he continued, his voice gentle but insistent, "I want you to know that meeting you has been the brightest thing to happen to me in years, even if it's only been for these few hours." Sister Margaret felt her cheeks burn in the lamplight. "Jake, you shouldn't say such things." "Why not? Because you're a nun? Because it's not proper?" He shifted slightly, wincing as the movement sent pain shooting through his trapped leg. "Sister, we might die down here. If these are my last hours on Earth, I'm not going to waste them pretending I don't feel what I feel." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sister Margaret found herself staring into his eyes, seeing there a depth of feeling that both thrilled and terrified her. She had taken vows, made promises to God that she had never questioned until this moment. But here, in the darkness beneath the earth, with death perhaps only hours away, those vows seemed like distant things, important but somehow less real than the man lying injured before her. "What do you feel?" she whispered, the question escaping her lips before she could stop it. Jake's eyes never left hers. "I feel like I've been waiting my whole life to meet you. I feel like every hard thing I've ever done, every mistake I've ever made was just preparing me for this moment. And I feel like if I die down here without telling you that, I'll have wasted the greatest gift God ever gave me." Sister Margaret's hand moved almost of its own accord, reaching out to touch his face. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, feeling the rough stubble and the warmth of his skin. "Jake, I know you can't feel the same way," he said quickly. "I know you've made promises that I have no right to ask you to break. But I needed you to know. I needed to say it out loud, just once." But as she looked into his eyes, Sister Margaret realized with a shock that she did feel the same way. The attraction she had felt from their first meeting had grown into something deeper, something that challenged everything she thought she knew about herself and her calling. The vows she had taken seemed suddenly like chains, binding her to a life that felt increasingly hollow compared to the vibrant reality of the man before her. "Jake," she said softly. Before she could finish the thought, a distant rumbling filled the air around them. For a terrifying moment, they both thought it was another collapse. But then they heard something that made their hearts leap with hope. Voices, faint but unmistakable, calling their names from somewhere above. The rescue had begun. As the hours passed and the sounds of digging grew closer, Sister Margaret and Jake found themselves caught between hope and a strange kind of despair. Rescue meant salvation, but it also meant returning to a world where their feelings for each other would be impossible, forbidden, and ultimately destructive. They talked through the night, sharing stories of their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Jake told her about growing up on a ranch in Texas, about losing his parents to cholera, about the loneliness that had driven him from town to town in search of something he couldn't name. Sister Margaret spoke of her childhood in Boston, of the calling she had felt to serve God, of the peace she had found in the convent walls. But as dawn approached somewhere far above them, they both knew that their time together was running out. The voices of the rescue team were getting closer, and soon they would be pulled back into the light, back into their separate worlds. It was then, in those final hours before rescue, that the inevitable happened. Sister Margaret had been checking Jake's injured leg, her hands gentle as she examined the wound. When she looked up, she found his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that took her breath away. "Margaret," he whispered, using her given name for the first time. She should have corrected him, should have insisted on the proper address. Instead, she found herself leaning closer, drawn by a force stronger than her will. Their lips met in the darkness, a kiss that was tender and desperate and full of all the words they couldn't say. For a moment that lasted forever, Sister Margaret forgot about her vows, forgot about the world above, forgot about everything except the warmth of Jake's mouth and the way her heart seemed to explode with joy and terror in equal measure. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard and tears were streaming down Sister Margaret's face. "I'm sorry," Jake whispered. "I shouldn't have—" "No," she said firmly, placing her fingers against his lips. "Don't apologize. Not for that. Never for that." They held each other then, as best they could with Jake trapped beneath the beam, and waited for the rescue that would separate them forever. The breakthrough came just as the sun was rising above ground. A shower of rocks and debris announced the arrival of the rescue team, and suddenly the small space was filled with lamplight and shouting voices. Murphy was there along with a dozen miners who had worked through the night to reach them. "Thank God you're alive," Murphy shouted as he directed the men to lift the beam that trapped Jake. "We thought for sure you were both goners." As the miners worked to free Jake and prepare him for transport to the surface, Sister Margaret found herself pushed to the side, forgotten in the excitement of the rescue. She watched as they carefully lifted Jake onto a makeshift stretcher, saw the pain in his eyes as they moved his injured leg. Just before they carried him toward the tunnel that led to freedom, Jake caught her eye. In that look, she saw everything: love, regret, longing, and the terrible knowledge that this was goodbye. "Sister," he called out as they began to carry him away. "Thank you. For everything." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Then he was gone, carried away by the rescue team, and she was alone in the darkness with only her memories and the taste of his kiss still on her lips. The journey to the surface felt like a dream. Sister Margaret was helped into the elevator cage and lifted slowly toward the light, leaving behind the darkness that had changed everything. When she finally emerged into the bright Nevada sunshine, she was greeted by cheers from the assembled crowd of miners and townspeople who had gathered to witness the rescue. But her eyes searched only for Jake. She found him being loaded into a wagon that would take him to the doctor in town. Their eyes met one last time across the crowd, and she saw in his face the same mixture of love and loss that she felt in her own heart. Then the wagon pulled away, carrying him out of her life forever. Sister Margaret returned to her duties at the mining camp, tending to the sick and injured, offering comfort to the dying. But everything had changed. The prayers that had once brought her peace now felt hollow. The rituals that had given her life meaning seemed empty and mechanical. She found herself thinking constantly of Jake, wondering if his leg had healed properly, if he had left the territory, if he ever thought of her. The memory of their kiss haunted her dreams and made her question everything she had believed about her calling. 3 weeks after the rescue, she received word that Jake had recovered from his injuries and left Silver Creek, heading west toward California. He had left no message for her, no word of goodbye. She told herself it was better that way, that a clean break was the only way they could both move forward with their lives. But late at night, when she knelt in prayer in her small tent, Sister Margaret found herself asking God not for forgiveness, but for understanding. Had their meeting been mere chance? Or had there been a divine purpose in bringing them together in the darkness? Was love always a sin when it challenged the vows she had taken? Or could it sometimes be a gift, even when it couldn't be acted upon? She never found answers to those questions, but she carried the memory of Jake Morrison with her for the rest of her life, a secret flame that burned in the darkness of her heart. And sometimes, when the desert wind howled across the barren landscape, she could swear she heard his voice calling her name, reminding her that even in the deepest darkness, love could find a way to shine. The Silver Creek mine was abandoned 6 months later, deemed too dangerous for continued operation. The tunnels where Sister Margaret and Jake had shared their forbidden night were sealed forever, buried beneath tons of rock and earth. But the memory of what had happened there lived on, a testament to the power of love to transform even the most impossible circumstances. Years later, when Sister Margaret had returned to Boston and taken up residence in a quiet convent, she would sometimes receive letters from the West. They were never signed, but she always knew who had sent them. They spoke of cattle ranches and wide open spaces, of sunsets over the mountains, and the endless possibility of the frontier. They never mentioned love directly, but between the lines, she could read the same longing that filled her own heart. She never wrote back, but she kept every letter hidden away in a small wooden box beneath her bed. And when she died, many years later, the other sisters found the box and wondered at its contents. Dozens of letters from a stranger, and a small piece of silver ore that seemed to glow with its own inner light. They never knew the story behind those treasures, never understood that they were looking at the physical remnants of a love that had burned bright in the darkness beneath the earth, a love that had changed 2 lives forever, even though it could never be fully realized. The mine collapse had trapped Sister Margaret and Jake for one night, but the memory of that night had held them both captive for the rest of their lives. In the end, perhaps that was enough, to know that love existed, that it was real and powerful and transformative, even when it couldn't be acted upon. In the vast expanse of the American West, where dreams were born and died with equal frequency, their story became just another legend whispered around campfires and in saloon corners. But for those who knew the truth, it served as a reminder that sometimes the most profound connections happen in the most unlikely places, and that love, once kindled, never truly dies. The silver mine had given up its treasures and claimed its victims, but it had also witnessed something rare and beautiful, a love that transcended circumstance, that found light in the deepest darkness, and that proved that even the most forbidden desires could be transformed into something sacred and eternal. And in the end, that was the greatest treasure of all.